Hi guys, so today we are going to talk about specific strategies to use with the negative case. And the first thing that I'm going to teach you about these strategies is how to run a disadvantages case. So remember, the negative position, your goal is that you are trying to create clash. So you're trying to present sound arguments for why the affirmative plan may not or will not work. So to do this, you're going to attack the affirmative with a very coordinated strategic plan. I think when we think about the affirmative, you guys are already aware that there's a lot of different ways that people can attack these issues. Like they can have such different cases. But there are definitely some great strategies that you can use to combat a lot of these different styles of cases. And one of the earliest things you'll do is look at their stock issues and see which ones are the weakest. So what we're going to look at first is a style that you can run, and it is called disadvantages. You might also hear it called a Disad or a DA. And what it says is basically that while the affirmative plan may correct existing problems in the status quo, it may also produce undesirable effects or unintended consequences. So your case would basically be that you are saying whatever they're doing to change the status quo is going to cause more harms than good. So your plan, you're going to prove basically that the bad outweighs the good in their plan. So I have an example that I'll use throughout us talking about negative strategies today, and it's about, so let's say our topic is U.S. military relationship with NATO. So if the affirmative is saying that removing U.S. troops stationed in NATO countries would lower our military spending and decrease the budget deficit, then your disadvantage to that might be that the absence of U.S. troops in Western Europe removes deterrence of aggression in places like Russia. So Russia's actions towards Ukraine serve as an example to that potential threat. So whatever their case is about, I mean, you can use this to say that if we were to remove our troops in any NATO countries, that these bad things are going to happen, and that is more important than removing the troops. So with that same topic, another way that you could run a Disad on it is saying something like NATO peacekeeping operations like those in Bosnia in the 1990s only work with U.S. presence. So absence of U.S. troops increases the possibility of needless deaths. So you're saying that the amount of deaths that would occur by us leaving is way more important than any money that we would be able to generate by saving money on troops. So that's kind of the main idea of a Disad, is that you're finding something that would apply in many situations for that topic. So it's not like you're having to redesign a whole negative case when you hear a new affirmative case. So you're looking for something that's kind of overarching that you can apply to a lot of different categories. So something else that you should be doing while you're the negative is keeping track of what the affirmative calls their advantages. So they're going to offer you a list of advantages or good things that are going to happen while they're reading your case. So you need to take notes on those and be prepared to link your disadvantages to the specific advantages they listed. So if they say, one advantage is we're going to decrease the budget deficit, you would say that while, yes, you may decrease budget deficit, you're actually going to lose millions of lives. So that kind of comparison is known as a cost-benefit analysis. So that's what you guys are going to be doing. You're going to try and make one-on-one comparisons. So for example, lives saved versus dollars lost versus unemployment rates. You do not have to just compare like and like. Like it doesn't have to be you're comparing lives saved versus lives lost, for example. It can be comparing two different things. When we make these kinds of cost-benefit analysis examples, they become more value judgments, and you can explain why yours should be valued higher than the affirmative, because really you're just trying to convince the judge that the affirmative's plan does not provide all of the good things it says it does, and yours should be valued more. Like we should worry more about the lives that we're losing by pulling out of NATO countries rather than the money we're saving. Another thing that you can do when you're doing cost-benefit analysis is you're looking at utilitarianism, which is basically this concept that we should be doing what is best for the greatest number of people. So you can talk about how their plan does not actually do what's best for most people. It's really just doing what's best for a small minority group, and we should value the good of the greater number of people over that. So in your Disad case, there are two different types of disadvantages, and you'll choose one of these types that you're going to really be focusing on to talk about the effects. So the first one is called linear disadvantages. So this is more of there's a particular situation that will occur the more this disadvantage happens. So for my example, we're talking about hydroelectric power. So let's say the affirmative calls for more hydroelectric power. You can argue that there's a direct correlation between increased hydroelectric power and increased fish deaths. This leads to increased harms from a loss of protein source. So there's a very linear progression to this. It's, A, then B, then C, then D. The other type of disadvantage, which I think I've seen more often in high school debates than the other, is called brink disadvantages. So this is arguing that the affirmative proposal is going to push the status quo over the brink and ultimately lead to major problems. It's going over the cliff. Think of the brink as a cliff you're going over. So for my example here, adding one particular law, any law, so you could do any case here for this, would strain our relationships with China, which would cause us to go to war with China, and any war we're going to have now would be a nuclear war, which means nuclear destruction of the planet. So ultimately, you passing this law is going to lead to nuclear destruction. So these are often very generic and not unique enough to win. You'd have to have major steps in between and prove exactly how this would happen for sure. But I see this run a lot in high school debates. So brink of destruction, basically. So when we're running a disadvantage case, this is the key components that you need for your case. And I'll go into each of these different things more specifically in a minute. So you'll have the thesis of the DA, so the main point of the argument, kind of like your tagline. Then you'll have to talk about uniqueness, your link, the brink, internal link, and impact. So after you give your thesis, you have to talk about how your DA is unique. You have to demonstrate that the DA does not occur now with the status quo or is insignificant now with the status quo. So this major harm that's going to happen is fine now if we leave everything as it is. But if we change something, then this bad thing's going to happen. So with the NATO example, this looks like, U.S. commitment to NATO currently keeps Russia in check. So right now, Russia's in check. But if we start to pull away, then Russia's no longer in check and we have to worry about what Russia's doing. Next, you would show the link, so the actual link to the argument. So you'll show that the affirmative takes an action that specifically directs to your DA. So with the NATO example, this would be your link. Loss of U.S. commitment through the affirmative mandated withdrawal emboldens Russia. That's the link you have to make. And then here's our example of the brink. So you're going to show that the action taken by the affirmative is enough to upset the status quo and plunge us into the effects and impacts of the DA. So with the NATO example, Russia empirically has expanded in places like the Ukraine when it has perceived a potential lack of response. So the fact that they don't have anybody that is keeping them in line, they will try to take advantage of that. And that will lead us to the, big bad brink, slippery slope of, Russia trying to take over places. Then you're going to do what's called an internal link. So this is really just a reiteration explaining step by step the sequence of events the affirmative causes with its plan. So with the NATO example, U.S. withdrawal is a catalyst for Russia to invade another country without retaliation from NATO. Then you list your impact. So the negative has to clearly show that the final effects are bad. So compare these directly to the affirmative advantages and clearly state how the negative outweighs them all. So with the NATO example, the greater likelihood of Russia influence and potential war in Eastern Europe results with losing millions of lives. So you would not just solely run a Disad, so you'd also be trying to attack them on some other fronts, and you kind of just get to mix and match what you think will work best with each AF case that you hear. So some other negative strategies that you're going to kind of filter in with your Disad would be things like attacking significance and harms, their inherency, and their solvency. So when you're talking about their significance and harms, you're going to challenge the significance of their contentions. Odds are there are not probably these really grave problems that they can talk about that the government has not already attempted to solve already. So one thing that you're going to try and prove is that will this change really be that significant? Will it affect enough people to really make a large change? Another thing that you can look at is if they have presented quantifiable data. So ask for those numbers, especially if they keep alluding to millions of lives. Like ask them, how many million? How do you know that exactly? Where are you getting this from? What kind of study is this from? So they must be able to prove that this significant change is happening. So the same with the harms. They have to prove how severe this harm is with like specific data and examples. So feel free to question those things. Especially if you have cards or any kind of research that says the opposite of what they're saying, or even if it supports them, but it gives a smaller number. So that's when you can read your own evidence that does provide specific answers, and then your information should be valued higher and the judge should be leaning more towards your points. Another thing you can argue is about their inherency. So to argue against their inherency, you'll need to prove how the present system is already addressing the need that they listed or their advantages without the resolution. So this is a better option to run if you don't have a DA for their specific topic, like you feel like your DA doesn't line up very well to them. Because if you do run a full DA, you run the risk of making yours not unique enough. And that will kind of like make you lose the round because you have to prove uniqueness. So all it takes is them pointing out that that case isn't very unique to them for you to kind of lose everything. And then the last thing that you can question is really their solvency. So the workability of their case. So some things that you should be questioning about their affirmative plan. One of the first things is funding. So can we actually reasonably fund this? Where are they getting their money from? So a lot of times people will say like, we'll give this amount of money per person in like tax credits or something like that. So do the math on like the people, like would that number actually be viable? Could we physically give, every person $5 or whatever it is? So are the cuts they're proposing actually enough money to cover their plan? Because a lot of people will identify like, oh, we'll cut spending, to the military budget by like 0.2%, and that'll give us the money. But make them show you that math, like make sure that they're actually adding up to be enough money to cover what they need to get done. Another thing, when they do tell you they're cutting spending to certain programs, you can make part of your case then about the disadvantages that would happen by cutting that program. So if they say they're going to cut, health services, you point out how many people will use those services and how much of a detriment it would be to their livelihood if they didn't have those. So the last thing that you could talk about with solvency is really enforcement. So yeah, they presented this great plan, but can you actually enforce that people will do it? What's in place to make sure that violations can be detected? Why isn't this plan already in place if it's so good? Like what's keeping it from being implemented? And then the last thing I wanted to talk about with your negative case is just make sure that you're questioning their evidence, question their cards, make them link their evidence back to the goals of their plan or the advantages that they're saying. So many teams actually don't understand their case all that well, and so they'll make these statements and then they're not actually able to link back their evidence to their argument. And that's where you can really attack as a negative. All right, well, that's our intro to negative case DAs for today. So thanks for watching and let me know if you have any questions.